thank you all for taking time out of a very dreary day to come to this talk. And while I will try to stick to my notes and hopefully leave about 20 minutes of time for question and answer, I will be covering a lot of different ground. I will also be sharing sources and documents that may use offensive language. And I just want to warn everybody about that in advance, because we're going to be talking about religion, slavery, and its intersection, both to Bray Schools and actually the Bishop of London. So without further ado, I want to say it's an immense honor to be speaking here amongst family and friends and new acquaintances, hopefully, at Fulham Palace House and Garden as part of the Black History 365 lecture series. It's equally significant that this talk would actually coincide with the 302nd anniversary of the founding of the Bray Associates, an Anglican charitable organization which had extensive global reach in the 18th, 19th, and the 20th centuries. Within the context of my research, the Associates of Dr. Bray are particularly significant in understanding Black education, both Black education in Virginia, but also Black education within the entire British Atlantic world, and especially Black education in the years leading up to the American Revolution. As you may know, the United States has another anniversary coming up, and it's really interesting to see how these schools do or do not coincide with that event. So the founder of this organization, who you can see on the screen in the very beautiful dark wig, is Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray, who was a confidant and a contemporary of Bishop Edmund Gibson, who resided at Fulham Palace and was the Bishop of London from 1723 until 1748. Bray and Gibson certainly knew each other, since they corresponded over the North American colonies frequently. And it's likely that Bray, known for his overwhelming amount of energy, even as a septuagenarian in the 1720s, visited Fulham Palace and visited Gibson here when the Bishop of London was seeking his advice on the Anglican Church in British North America. And I think about this every time that I come to Fulham Palace. The first time I was here was 7 years ago. I actually came in the wrong way, and so I saw the Georgian part of Fulham Palace before anything else. So I had to walk through that beautiful, I got to walk through that beautiful palace, grounds and gardens. And at that time, I remember thinking Fulham it's an incredibly idyllic place. It's a beautiful place. It's a community space today. And so how can anyone who visits or resides here have anything but just a lovely experience? Ironically, those who resided and visited Fulham Palace in the 18th century did not always create idyllic spaces or places for those whose religious lives they oversaw in their colonial outposts. Gibson, Bray, and their contemporaries were directly involved in slavery, the slave trade, or racial subjugation for thousands of African diasporic and indigenous people across the British Atlantic world. Between 1720 and 1777 alone, the Church of England generated at least £440,962, what is today the modern equivalent of £724 million, of profits in investments from the South Sea Company, which held the largest contract in the trading of enslaved peoples to Spain and Portugal, also known as the Eighteenth contract. Gibson himself wrote pro-slavery tracts while living at Fulham Palace, as did the Associates of Dr. Bray as an organization. They also made almost £300,000, the modern equivalent, off of the South Sea Company themselves. It's impossible to separate a place like Fulham Palace from slavery, from power, and from global wealth. Yet, if scholars take the time to search through the most minute of records in collections held by the University of Oxford and Lambeth Palace Library, where most of the correspondence of the Bishop of London resides, it becomes very clear that Fulham Palace may be central to understanding slavery in British North America, but it's not the beginning or the end of the story. And in fact, it becomes very clear when you look at these records that the flow of religious pronouncements from Anglican leaders to disenfranchised enslaved peoples is not a seamless transaction. It never has been, but it's blatantly apparent in the 18th century. So that's actually what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the Bishop of London, the Associates of Dr. Bray, and highlight how records associated with both of those either individuals or organizations highlight the way that colonial communities pushed back against the religious epicenter of the British Empire in the 18th century. These types of encounters, which I'm going to discuss today, reverberated across the Atlantic and back to Virginia, then back to London, then back to Virginia again, in ways that were neither always understood nor expected. Despite Virginian enslavers attempting to undercut the ability of Black people to receive education, their demand for literacy still existed amongst individuals themselves. And this demand also clearly contradicted the intention behind Anglican religious instruction that existed in colonial America at the time. So where I want to start might seem a little surprising. While we're going to talk about the legacy and the lessons of Bray Schools, I'm not actually going to start with a Bray School, but I am going to start in Virginia. Where I'm going to start is by looking at a petition from 1723, almost 40 years before the first Bray School would open in Virginia. This petition came from Black Virginians. And by understanding the petition, scholars and the public can better appreciate that Black education in the Atlantic world far predates what we might know as freedmen's schools post-Civil War, or even the schools of the Associates of Dr. Bray. In fact, the fight for educational empowerment in Virginia itself actually originated with enslaved individuals rather than with Bishop Gibson or Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray. These individuals were bold and they were brave enough to demand education from the Bishop of London in some form, despite, quote, fear that our masters, for if they knew that we had sent home to your honor, we should go near to swing upon the gallows tree, end quote. So to discuss this petition, first, I really do have to tell you a little bit about Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray and the Associates of Dr. Bray. The Associates of Dr. Bray were founded on January 15th of 1724, although Bray began his work when he was very, very ill in Christmas of that year. Over the course of his entire life, Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray became a key influencer in how religious texts and ideas from the Church of England would spread across the British Empire. Henry Compton, one of Bishop Edmund Gibson's predecessors, also sought out Bray to be his first commissary of Maryland in the 17th century, which is an interesting choice considering that Maryland was founded as a Catholic colony. Well, Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray saw fit to make sure that did not continue. As the Bishop of London, Compton's ecclesiastical dominion in the 17th century did not just include London, it actually included all of the ever-growing colonial outposts in the British Empire, including Virginia and Maryland. Since he had a jurisdiction, a religious jurisdiction that was imperial in scope, it was impossible for him to manage without assistance. So this meant that Compton and other bishops of London would essentially require having accomplished ecclesiastical administrators, who were also known as commissaries, who served to report back to the Bishop of London on the religious health of the colony that they were assigned to. While Thomas Bray's time was remarkably short as the commissary of Maryland, he arrived in 1699 and was back in England by 1702 to help secure the passage of the Act to establish the Church of England in Maryland. His experiences there influenced his perspective on religious expansion within the British Empire for the rest of his entire life. Bray also established a variety of Anglican organizations, such as the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, whose bookplate you see on the screen. He helped found them in 1699, and the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, which was the SPCK, and that was founded in 1701. The former institution, the SPG, sent Anglican missionaries across the empire, while the latter organization, the SPCK, was more focused on establishing Anglican charity schools within England and publishing books on the principles of Christian religion for imperial use. Bray's investment in the Church of England and its growth across the British colonies is fairly clear in light of that, given that he started all of this work over 20 years before the Bray Associates were founded. Despite founding the Bray Associates in 1724, schools, official schools, one of which is still extant in Virginia, would take a very long time to be realized. By the time Dr. Bray passed away in February of 1730, there were some fairly heated debates amongst his associates, as they were called, on how to best use the funds. In fact, they proceeded to fight about how to spend money as a group for over 20 years. Eventually, the notion of schools for Black children were agreed upon, enough that by 1757, the secretary of the Bray Associates, Reverend John Waring, reached out to Dr. Benjamin Franklin while he was here in London to ask his opinion on the subject. Franklin, later the first official North American representative in the Bray Associates, recommended, of course, they start in Philadelphia. It seems very likely, in fact, that one of his own enslaved children by the name of Othello was sent to the Philadelphia Bray School. When the Philadelphia Bray School was deemed successful by the Bray Associates, 3 other key cities were selected. New York City, New York being really the seat of the slave trade for that colony, Newport, Rhode Island, also the seat of the slave trade for Rhode Island, and Williamsburg, Virginia, which was the capital of Virginia at that time, and Benjamin Franklin had just received an honorary degree from William and Mary. Through religious instruction, the Bray Associates in particular hoped that their education of free and enslaved Black children would resign these individuals to, quote, their state of servitude, end quote. That comes directly from the only book that was actually published by the Bray Associates in the 18th century, although many of the other books and tracts they sent worldwide espoused this idea. One of the largest numbers of copies of this particular pamphlet sent anywhere in the world was to Williamsburg, Virginia. The purpose behind a Bray School education, according to the Associates, would be that Black children would be seen but not heard. Obedience and subjugation were the key aim of instruction, regardless of whether the child was held in bondage or they were free. And the instructional intent of not only this pamphlet, but Bray Schools more broadly, was uniformly enforced in both northern and southern colonies. From the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century, the Associates of Dr. Bray established schools of various sizes and supplied literacy and religious instruction to free and enslaved Black boys and girls, although there were also a few indigenous schools, but that's a conversation maybe for another day. While each of these schools was unique in terms of children's makeup, teachers, location, the idea behind all of them was uniform: to support religious education that upheld imperialist and colonialist ideals, and to reinforce white supremacy within the student corpus. Hundreds of children across the British Empire received this instruction, although it's also very clear from the records of the Bray Associates that religious compliance was not a guaranteed outcome of these schools. In fact, more broadly, religious compliance was not a guaranteed outcome from the Church of England when it was sent to those of African descent. There has been significant interest in the last 10 years in particular, not only in the Associates of Dr. Bray, but their schools, because of recent rediscoveries. And I don't say discovery intentionally, because several people knew this school was there. It just took national attention to get it the move that it needed. In 2020, the original structure which housed the Williamsburg Bray School, of which over 400 Black children received education, was actually rediscovered in Williamsburg, Virginia. This event catalyzed ongoing discussions amongst museum professionals, scholars, and descendants of both enslavers and enslaved who utilized this school. It also brought up the fraught and paradoxical legacy of the Associates of Dr. Bray in deeply personal ways. This is one of my favorite examples. The building had already been moved once, and we couldn't put it back in its original location. That's also a much longer story. But we decided to move it to a more appropriate location in 2023. At that time, the Matthew Whaley School, which is actually named after another Church of England charity school in Williamsburg, Virginia, brought out their 4th grade students who had written the names of scholars that are still extant on the front of these lists, as well as the years the schools attended. They attended the schools. They held up these signs and had the names of the enslavers on the back of the pages as the building moved by. It was a really powerful moment. In many ways, the rediscovery served as a touchstone for how different communities remember history. And also, how do we remember, commemorate, and reckon with history that's tied to racial subjugation, that's tied to educational opportunity, and that's also tied to revolutions, both big and very, very small, in British North America. While recent national narratives have centered the idea that Black education in Virginia began with the Bray Associates and began with their school in Williamsburg, that's not exactly right. Yes, the Williamsburg Bray School did open on Michaelmas, also known as September 29th, in 1760. But based on extant sources, Black communities in Virginia were forcing a reckoning within educational frameworks supported by the Church of England far before the Williamsburg Bray School. Furthermore, they were having this reckoning with the Bishop of London himself. Between August 4th and September 8th of 1723, an appeal came from a group of enslaved individuals in Virginia. Based on the way the letter is written, it's written both in the singular and the plural. So we're still unsure how many individuals collaborated on this letter, whether it included both men or women, and the identities of the enslaved person or persons who actually wrote the letter. Although in the Q&A, if you'd like to ask me about it, I have some suspicions. What is clear, though, from the letter is that it is a missive that was a direct religious petition to Edmund Gibson, the Bishop of London, who had just been ordained as the Bishop of London. Within this petition, the petitioners address the institution of slavery outright. As historian Thomas N. Ingersoll stated in his analysis of the letter, quote, "It is the earliest known plea in the history of American slavery for liberation from a group of slaves." Sit with that for a minute. The earliest known petition sent to Fulham Palace. Over 30 years before the Williamsburg Bray School was started, Black Virginians were forcing a religious and educational reckoning within the Church of England. The petition itself, as I've mentioned, was written either by an individual or a communal group of enslaved individuals. It was also very specific in its demands. The author or the authors expressed deep awareness of the life or death stakes of this petition, as I have previously quoted in this presentation. And the petitioners also requested that the bishop help, quote, "release us out of this cruel bondage," end quote. The petitioners further stressed that, quote, "we are in ignorance of our salvation and we are kept out of the church," end quote. The writers, or writer, also go on to state very clearly not only what their demands are, but their desire for religious instruction, and specifically religious instruction and education. And what they say, and this is the first page of the petition, but what they say is that, quote, "our children may be brought up in the way of the Christian faith, and our desire is that they may be learned the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the 10 Commandments. And we desire that our children be put to school and learned to read through the Bible." Keep those demands in mind, because they're going to come up again in a place you might not expect. While this letter is the only known petition of a group of enslaved individuals to the Bishop of London, it actually highlights a repeated confluence of religion and revolution in colonial Virginia at this time. The 1720s were a pivotal decade in which enslaved uprisings were not only constantly happening, but frequently were linked to the belief that Protestant religion would create manumission. Referenced in a letter to the Bishop of London, again in 1731, Royal Governor William Gooch actually highlights this. He mentions that over the course of the last decade, multiple enslaved communities across Virginia had actually believed that the previous governor, Alexander Spotswood, was sent with orders from the king to actually free enslaved people who were Anglican. They believed that this petition and that this call from Governor Spotswood had been suppressed by the local government, leading to a spate of uprisings across Virginia. As stated by Gooch, quote, "Numbers of these poor creatures were taken up in all parts of the country for their unlawful meetings and examined, but no discovery could be made of any formed design of their rising. Only loose discourses that an order from His Majesty was brought in by Mr. Spotswood to set all those slaves free that were Christians and that the order was suppressed." They just so happened to all have uprisings at the same time, allegedly. According to Gooch, this belief was enough fodder to, quote, "incite them to rebellion in places such as Princess Anne and Norfolk counties, although all the way to the Blue Ridge, these were actually happening. It was only through, quote, "imprisonment and severe whippings of the most suspected," end quote, across Virginia, that the execution of 4 ringleaders in Norfolk and Princess Anne led to the quashing of the rebellions. The notion that enslaved uprising is relinked inherently to royal justice in colonial Virginia is actually not a new idea for most scholars. Based on the research of Wim Klooster, enslaved rebellions connected to the idea of what he describes as a liberating monarch are well documented across the British Empire at this point in time. It's just that most people have studied them in isolation, in their own county, commonwealth, state, and have not actually linked that it's a wider trend happening in the British Atlantic world. It appears that a white sailor mentioning, quote, "that the King of England had ordered they," enslaved people, "should all be set free," end quote, was actually what led Gooch to the belief that these were all concentrated uprisings. So the idea that a white sailor came in from somewhere across the British Atlantic world and mentioned to enslaved peoples that this order was being suppressed. However, it is also clear from other records, such as this one, that Black Virginians did not need a white sailor to inspire their resistance. Rebellion and revolution were not new to people in Williamsburg, Virginia, as I mentioned, the capital city of Virginia, while it was a British colony. In fact, it was more common than you'd think. In 1709, several people held in bondage by James Blair, who was actually Virginia's commissary to the Bishop of London, had participated in an uprising. It would be one of several. According to a letter written by government official Philip Ludwell and presented to the Governor's Council of that year, which is the highest seat of government in Virginia at the time, he stated, quote, "Pursuant to your command, I have had all of Dr. Blair's," I'm going to use the term enslaved people, "secured under guards by Jamestown at 11 of the clock yesterday. And I got examinations which I have herewith sent to you." Unfortunately, those examinations are not extant. "But we were of the opinion that these individuals should be discharged at the present, having no evidence against them and very little against others." This evidence appears to have been some kind of group uprising from a series of enslaved individuals in the counties of James City, Surrey, and Isle of Wight. And for anyone who's from Virginia, you know those are actually fairly close in proximity if you use water networks. This also was not the first or the last of uprisings, just the ones I have time to mention in this talk. One wonders if the individual or individuals connected to the 1723 petition were part of this uprising 14 years prior. If they weren't, then they certainly were aware of it. As well as the 1710 Easter Uprising, where 2 leaders of the plot were actually tried by the General Court in Williamsburg, convicted, and executed. Given Blair's extensive knowledge of ecclesiastical information in London, it's really interesting to see that a group of enslaved individuals enslaved by him not only rise up 14 years prior to this petition, but also that the petition seems to have knowledge of what Blair has knowledge of. Access to religious literacy instruction was encouraged by Blair, actually in 1699, if not encouraged by everyone generally in Virginia. Actually, such instruction for enslaved people was incredibly abundant in Blair's parish, which happened to be Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, Virginia. In 1724, Blair expounded upon a variety of educational institutions operating within his jurisdiction, and he said, quote, I have little schools where they teach to read and write and arithmetic, set up wherever there happens to be a convenient number of scholars. Of these, I have 4 in my parish, in addition to a school for Indigenous individuals and the College of William and Mary. All of those operating in the same city, right outside of where all of these uprisings are happening in the 1710s. This area, Williamsburg, was known for its long-standing relationship to the Church of England and a higher concentration of Anglican educational opportunities across multiple parishes, multiple people, multiple backgrounds. Even though Williamsburg did not have a printing press until many decades later, cities like Williamsburg were places of words. They were places of news, and they were places of information. And it's reasonable to assume that the 1723 petition might have been written by a group of enslaved individuals who not only came from Tidewater, Virginia, but also a community connected to Blair himself. The reason this seems likely is because earlier in 1723, just a few months before the 1723 petition was written, Blair was the first person in Williamsburg, and actually in Virginia, to know about the ordination of Bishop Gibson. In early 1723, Edmund Gibson became the Bishop of London after the death of John Robinson. At the time of Gibson's ascent to the bishopric, the position already had immense influence, not only within the borders of England, but as I've mentioned, within the empire itself. Gibson, when he is appointed, realizes that he really needs to solidify his ecclesiastical role in the British colonies. It's somewhat tenuous, depending on who you talk to. And in an attempt to strengthen his petition, he decided to send out questionnaires during the process of seeking a royal commission to serve as the actual bishop for the British colonies. As a man already inclined to order and organization, these questionnaires were the perfect way for him to both gather information and simultaneously assert authority. Many of these questionnaires actually survive, and they're held in the archives of Lambeth Palace, including 28 responses from the 54 Virginia parishes at that time. It's actually extraordinary, so many people responded. The questions range extensively, including information on glebe lands, the tenure of ministers, and whether parochial libraries are available. However, one of the most compelling questions asked by Gibson, and I discovered this week while in the records at Oxford, it's only asked to ministers within the British colonies, not ministers here in London, is question number 7. Quote, "Are there any infidels, bond or free, within your parish, and what means are used for their conversion?" End quote. Blair actually responds twice to this petition, once as the representative to the Bishop of London for Virginia, and once for his own parish. And Blair was really primed and prepped to send a response, because as I said, he was the first person to know that Edmund Gibson had been appointed the bishop in July of that year. He actually writes him 2 letters. One, he writes saying, "I have heard the previous bishop has passed away, and I am wondering who the next bishop will be." And one 2 weeks later that says, "Oh, I've heard you've been made the bishop. I'm very excited for you." So it seems likely that if anyone's going to know what's happening with the Bishop of London, it's not only in Williamsburg, but it's James Blair. Gibson didn't just send out these questionnaires, though, of course, to James Blair. He sent them out everywhere. And we see that most of the questionnaires are sent in sometime between late 1723, early 1724, and he receives most of his responses in mid-1724. The point on timing I know may sound pedantic, but it's actually quite important, since it begs the question, how might these questionnaires have been influenced by the petition written in August of 1723 from Black Virginians to the Bishop of London? Given that the average time it took to travel one way from Virginia to London in the 18th century was actually only 6 to 8 weeks, and it was much faster if it was a packet ship, it's very likely that this petition made it to Gibson prior to the questionnaires not only being sent out, but being written. Speed and secrecy will also have been required from the petitioners to ensure not only that this letter made its way to Fulham Palace, but that the writer or writers were not executed for their transgression. So, did the petitioners not only know about Bishop Gibson's appointment, but did they work quickly enough to respond? I would argue that they did. But again, we can debate it more in the Q&A if you'd like. However, as it relates to Bray Schools and their legacies, a second set of questions arises that I think for the talk today is a little more important. How might the timing of the 1723 petition have influenced the formation of the Associates of Dr. Bray? Consider, the organization was founded on January 15th, 1724. I know I've said it several times, repetition is key. However, although they were founded on January 15th of 1724, they were almost completely inactive until 1730. Why was Bray so focused on founding an organization for Black Anglican education just a few months after Gibson got this letter? Why then? Why that moment? Well, Virginia was actually on Reverend Bray and Reverend Gibson's minds collectively as a team in the fall of 1723, right around the time that Bishop Gibson would have received this petition. On the request of Edmund Gibson, this is also an image of James Blair, in case any of you were wondering. On the request of Bishop Edmund Gibson, Bray actually wrote him ideas in October of 1723 regarding the, quote, American diocese. And he offers very specific suggestions for laying the groundwork on how both men might support the expansion of the Church of England, specifically in Virginia. Based on the tone of the letter, this is not the first time they had discussed the matter. And in typical ways for Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray, he starts the letter by, I'm paraphrasing, by saying, well, I don't have much to say to you, and then writes 7 single-spaced pages, very, very detailed. It took me about a day to fully transcribe it. It's also very abundant that not only were they discussing Virginia, and that they were discussing the British Empire amongst each other, but that something happens that seems to lead to the impetus of them working together on Black education. What might that something be? I think it's likely the 1723 petition. But what's really interesting is that I actually found something else in the Oxford archives, like 2 days ago, that really highlights this. And this explains actually why archival research is so important. Because Bray and Gibson were writing about Virginia. They were writing about religious instruction, but they did much more than just write about it in 1723. After Bray suffered a severe illness during the Christmas season of 1723, he immediately set to work forming the Associates of Dr. Bray. During the months after the illness, Bray actively engaged with, quote, some missionary sent to him by the Bishop of London in his measure proposed for the instruction of the Negroes, end quote. Again, maybe it's not the smoking gun I would like that says Bray and Gibson absolutely talked about this petition. But it seems really interesting that the petition arrives, the questionnaire shows up, the Bray Associates get formed, and also they just so happen to be talking about Black education with one another. Interesting coincidence. As the Associates of Dr. Bray, which were being tentatively formed at this time, were being founded, Bray was already engaging not only in the religious instruction of Black people across the British Atlantic, but engaging with it on the behalf of the Bishop of London, who is sending him missionaries. The Bray Associates' origins seem to have clear ties to Anglican leaders like Edmund Gibson, who just a few months prior received a petition from Black Virginians demanding religious education. Now I'll go back to the part I didn't have to write out by hand. Gibson and Blair's thoughts also actually mirror James Blair and what he's writing about at the same time, who, as I mentioned, was the commissary of Virginia for a very long time, almost 50 years. Well before the 1723 petition, Blair had actually set the tone for how the Anglican Church would relate to enslaved peoples in Virginia. In 1699, 2 propositions drafted by James Blair for consideration within the Virginia General Assembly were set forth in front of the legislature. The first scheme was entitled, quote, a proposition for encouraging the Christian education of Indians, Negroes, and mulatto children, end quote, suggesting that religious instruction of enslaved individuals was very much neglected by masters and mistresses. The three most important parts of this petition was that Blair suggested enslaved children who were sufficiently versed in the 10 Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer by the time they were 14 would become tax deductible until they turned 18. This measure kept in line with the economic interests of slaveholders and the proselytization of church instruction within the Church of England. Those three preferred forms of Anglican instruction also are mirrored almost word for word in the 1723 petition. The second proposal Blair put forward was titled, quote, "A proposition for the encouragement of the clergy," which established better glebe lands and properties for attracting what he called learned and pious clergy. You also see Gibson mirroring this in his petitions or his questionnaires. In this case, though, he wasn't just referring to land. He was actually also referring to enslaved peoples. And what he purported or proposed was that in order to retain good clergy, well-versed clergy, well-educated clergy, through suitable encouragements, they would purchase enslaved people for each minister for their glebe land in Virginia. Usually between 4 and 5 enslaved individuals with an overseer and, quote, "a stock of cattle," end quote. Unsurprisingly, both proposals were put forward to the Virginia General Assembly, and the response was drastically different for each one. Indeed, Blair's optimistic assumption that both proposals would be accepted was quickly corrected by the government. The first proposal on Black education was never seriously considered, being pigeonholed before it could even make it to the entire legislature. However, the second proposal was approved and was actually moved forward beyond the legislature into the daily lives of ministers and enslaved people in Virginia for decades to come. So ironically, you have Gibson working on his questionnaires. You have Bray founding the Bray Associates. You have Blair having these petitions that don't move forward, and then a series of enslaved uprisings, all happening within this 25-year time period. It's a lot going on at once. It doesn't stop there, though, because Gibson, Bray, and Blair's promotion of Virginia to expand religious control and slavery collided almost starkly and immediately with Black revolutionary action. And in fact, no better place can you find this than the minute meetings of the Bray Associates. Hidden amongst the most banal of records, and for anyone who's had to read minute meetings before, you know, they're not exciting. The first year of the Bray Associates actively working post Bray's death in 1730, they specifically mention uprisings in Virginia. In fact, just 8 months after Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray's death, the Bray Associates themselves reported on what they deemed disturbing report about insurrection. This is what they say in the minute meetings, and I'll contextualize it for you because it's fairly archaic language. They expressed, quote, "The supposed insurrections of the Negroes in Virginia and in other plantations in America had occasioned several reflections on the designs of the Associates, it being proposed that the best methods of preventing the effects thereof, the uprising itself, would be to inquire to the truth of the facts. And every Bray Associate was commissioned to write to correspondents in Virginia and in the plantations to determine if these uprisings were happening, how disturbed should they be, and if they could be linked to education, how might the fallout for the Bray Associates be mitigated." While the correspondence between the associates of Dr. Bray and their colonial agents has not survived, these concerns were actually addressed in the next month's meeting. They worked very quickly. They found that, quote, "there had been no insurrection of Negroes in Virginia," end quote, "with any designs of instructing them in Christian religion, despite an overwhelming amount of evidence I have just provided you from Virginia archives that that's not the case." So they decided that, well, they really shouldn't be too worried, and they'd let the matter rest, ignore the concerns, and see if they could just keep going on. This reaction clearly demonstrates that the Associates were aware of Black resistance taking place in Virginia, as well as its potential ties to religious instruction and Black liberation. It also demonstrates that Black peoples were not waiting to receive religious schooling at the hands of Anglican charities, but they were taking matters into their own hands, both for spiritual reasons or other reasons. While the associates of Dr. Bray and the contemporaries would spend the next century attempting to use religious instruction to control Black populations, the 1723 Petition and all of these other examples show that educational opportunities couldn't actually be contained, despite the Church of England having a very clear intent behind why they were offering Black education, and that it was concerning enough that they at least brought it up several times in different reports. So what can we learn, right? What can we learn about Williamsburg, London, Fulham Palace, Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray, the Church of England, from studying this petition and studying it in context? Well, the first thing is we shouldn't assume that white Anglican religious and educational opinions were the only ones held in Virginia. Clearly they weren't, if this 1723 petition was anything to go by. A community of Black individuals, likely from in and around Williamsburg, Virginia, gathered together to call for a fundamental shift in the social order. This both came into direct conflict with enslavers, and it came into direct conflict with the Church of England solidifying the idea that religious education could be used to control people. What we also see in the decades following the 1723 petition is that the legacy and spirit of these petitioners lives on in some interesting ways in Williamsburg. I'm going to talk about two students. For those of you who know me, you know I could spend 5 hours talking about these children. But I find it really interesting that less than one, maybe two generations after that 1723 petition was written, likely in and around Williamsburg, you see students at the Williamsburg Bray School pushing in the same way that these petitioners did. One of my favorite examples actually exists for Isaac B. Isaac B was actually enslaved by James Blair's nephew, John Blair, who sent the single largest number of Bray School students to the Williamsburg Bray School, which I have always found very interesting. Isaac B had likely an enslaved mother, but a free Black father. Regardless, the status of Virginian enslaved peoples was that their status was that of their mothers. So even if they had a free father, white or Black, they would be enslaved. We know that Isaac B was taught through some of the texts that I've already highlighted, teaching subservience and subjugation. And yet, despite spending several years at the Williamsburg Bray School, he didn't take that instruction at face value. When he was either 18 or 19 years old in 1774, he self-liberated from his new enslaver, which was James Blair's great-great-grandson, if my memory serves me correctly. The families are very much overlapping. In the runaway ad that is posted by his enslaver, it says that Isaac B, quote, thinks he has a right to his freedom, end quote. Nowhere in the teachings of the Williamsburg Bray School would freedom have been not only instructed, but encouraged. And yet, he felt he had a right to his freedom. He did have a right to his freedom. And this would not be the last time that he ran. He actually was re-enslaved very shortly after this runaway ad. And we actually, just 3 years ago, found another runaway ad for him when he is in his 40s. When he runs away, he takes a valuable horse, a set of pistols, and all the legal records for Richmond. There's another letter, I think it's a little more subtle example of the legacy of the 1723 petition in Hannah. Hannah was 7 years old when she started attending the Williamsburg Bray School. She was 10 at the writing of this letter. Her enslaver, Robert Carter Nicholas, lamented to the Bray Associates that while essentially the education was valuable, it could not get him the compliance from enslaved individuals he so drastically sought. In this letter, he refers to Hannah as a jade, which in Middle English is the term for a broken down horse. And in the 18th century, according to Samuel Johnson's English dictionary, was meant to describe a woman of ill repute. The very fact that he described a 10-year-old girl as a jade is discursively violent. But also, there's several things you can learn about Hannah in this letter too. He talks about Hannah and her lack of reformation in regards to a Bray School education. And clearly he's irritated about her lack of reformation enough that he chose to write to a group of men he'd never actually met, complaining about her lack of compliance. What becomes clear from looking at the 1723 petition and from Isaac and from Hannah, just to name a few, is that the Church of England had a clear idea for what Black education was supposed to do, and it clearly wasn't working. In addition to those examples, I have the privilege to learn and collaborate with descendants of these scholars who actually mirror their ancestors' experiences both in oral histories and written testimonials from their families. In some cases, in particular in the case of Colonel Lafayette Jones, his self-published materials only now being studied despite being produced decades prior due to the rediscovery of the Bray School. We had Descendants Outreach Week in 2023, and this is me in front of the Bray School as it's being restored with some of those descendants. The legacy of Bray Schools across North America highlight that education is neither passively received by children, nor always confined to the wants or desires of groups in power. This is especially potent, I think, as an idea to remember in this moment, and for me in particular, coming from the United States. It's often a give and take, hidden amongst the most innocuous of records that you would never want to read for hours on end in archives across the world, and in particular, actually, in archives of the Church of England. The 18th century, I think, sometimes can feel very far away from our modern world. It certainly can feel like that for me. London can also feel very removed from Williamsburg, Virginia. This is maybe not surprising since almost 4,000 miles in a literal ocean separate us. However, the choices we make, the words we write, and the people we communicate with leave legacies like invisible tendrils that connect us across time and space. And sometimes those connections aren't always clear. Sometimes you have to do the work of what some historians called critical fabulation, piecing pieces of records together to get to a point. But I think that work's important. Fulham Palace, Williamsburg, Virginia, the Associates of Dr. Bray, the Williamsburg Bray School, and the 1723 petition from Black Virginians are part of those invisible strands of global connectivity. It's through careful research, open communication, and public reflection in spaces like this that make reflection in our modern world possible. Really important, vital work in this moment. Further, such contemplation and critical thinking is imperative if we are to shepherd the ideas of the former Archbishop of Canterbury, the Right Reverend Justin Welby, into being. That is to say, this reflection, which itself is a form of reparation, of reflection and address, is not just about, quote, inherited guilt. It is about living up to our responsibilities in the present to help create a world that promotes human flourishing for all. Understanding the Church of England's connections to Black education, as well as the Bishop of London and Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray's ties to this education, both positive and negative, is part of that responsibility. So thank you for being part of that today.
So we have just over 5 minutes.
No, I'm so sorry.
So we have just over 5 minutes for questions. If anyone has a quick question they want to throw, Nicole.
I have one.
Yeah.
It's not quick.
It's okay. I'll do my best.
Well, we can talk about it.
Yes, yeah.
So I was thank you first and foremost for that beautiful presentation. I was very struck by two things. Both of them were instances of your reframing of certain things. So the first was, I very much liked that you sort of made the effort to stress the agency and the sort of like active role that Black people played in this history. I like that you kept referring back to the petition. I like that you showed sort of all of the connections between what happened after that petition was sent. I also like that you reframed just now at the end the sense of guilt that people or certain communities might feel or experience or feel like they have inherited somehow.
Sure.
And you frame that into sort of a common sense responsibility that everybody shares with everybody. My question is, I am assuming that as a researcher you have needed to prompt yourself in your own process and in your own research and sitting in the archives and writing up these thoughts that you're having to reframe these things actively for yourself. I know I experience the same thing, and it can be sometimes sort of surprisingly difficult.
I agree, yes. Yeah.
So I just wanted to know what your experience with that is like.
Yeah, this is a great question. So if I've heard you correctly, the question is, how do we, in this moment of doing reparative work or reflective work or reconsidering the way a story is told, not only check our own selves and our positionalities, but what are the processes or steps or experiences associated with that? Does that?
Yeah.
Okay. I will give you two examples, one from a descendant and one from my colleague, actually, who reviewed this before I came. And I will say for both of these, you have to have, I think, a combination of a sureness of, I know I'm doing work that is important, while also being willing to check your assumptions or check the way you've presented something based on constructive feedback. And I also think that's why having a wide community, not just of scholars, but in my case of also descendants, is really, really important. So the first example that comes to my mind, I was talking about Colonel Lafayette Jones's oral history, or an oral history that was then turned into a self-published book, my great-great-great-grandfather's journey to an island of freedom. And he actually writes about the Bray School in there. I was like, wow, this is amazing. I just started my research. Incredible, a descendant, I must meet him. And when I did, and he passed away, unfortunately, several years ago and was just such an important cornerstone in the community. And I went to a colleague of mine who you've maybe heard me mention, Janice Canaday, who is currently the African-American Community Engagement Coordinator at Colonial Williamsburg. She wasn't at the time, but she was a colleague. And I came to her and I said, oh my gosh, I've just read this incredible book, Miss Janice, because she and I had been talking about my work on the Bray School for many years at that point. And I said, do you know him? And she went, yeah, he's my cousin. And I was like, what, so you're a descendant? She said, yeah, probably. I said, oh, I didn't know. She said, you didn't ask. She has very helpful lessons in very short turns of phrase. And that really made me check my assumptions at the door of like, I am, as a young scholar, approaching a history that other people have studied far before me. But also as a white scholar, making assumptions about what is available or what isn't available, and her willingness to work with me as just one individual, to think about the way I reframe has been so valuable. And then I think from an academic standpoint, I am very lucky to work for the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. I have an incredible boss. His name's Dr. Andrew Davenport. And he's all about moving junior scholars up and forward. And when you work in a doctoral program, the whole job is to break you down so that you don't think you know anything. And then they go, hooray, you've passed your exams where you don't know anything. Now write 300 pages and seem confident that you know what you're doing, which is very antithetical. And, and I showed him my paper before I left because I wanted his input. And he looked at it and he said, I really like it. He said, but you doubt yourself in your words. And I said, well, I'm playing with the theory of critical fabulation. He said, yes, but you wait to bring the point home until the very end. And sometimes it's better for you to bring the point forward. They can disagree with you. The whole point on scholarship is that you study sources, you debate them, you engage with them in different ways. And that was a very generous way of saying, have more confidence in what you're doing. But I think those two examples are why your question is important. It's important to build groups of people who want to build you up, and also groups of people who will question you at every turn. And I think that is what makes exceptional scholarship. And if you're unwilling to do either one of those things, that's how gaps and bits and pieces get lost. So I hope that answers your question.
It does.
Yeah.
I'm just very aware of everyone's
Yeah.
time, so can we give Nicole another big massive round of applause?
Thank you.